I told Donna I needed quiet. I told her, very plainly, that the sound of a room full of testimony, one voice looping on itself in my head, was starting to break me. For a week, I had been living inside someone else's last calm, a woman who had described the moment before she died with a patience that had become a loop in my edits. Every fade, every hiss, every cough had become a track I could not turn off. So I booked time off, said I would go north for a few days to get nothing but wind and wood and the low percussion of water on a shoreline. She approved it without drama, the same professional compassion she used when schedules fell apart. "Go," Donna said. "Get rid of it." It felt like permission from the thing that had hired me to sit with other people's tragedies. I packed my recorder, my laptop, a small kit of mics and cables, and a hardcover notebook I'd been using to map audio anomalies, timestamps, atmospheric notes, the kinds of tiny details editors hoard when trying to make tape feel honest. The notebook would later feel like something else, but at the time it was banal, pockets of a project, like packing a set of spare faders. I drove until the strip malls thinned out, and the lines on the highway ceded to two-lane roads that mended themselves with tar. The map on my phone receded into a pale dot of signal, then a blinking searchlight. The last bar dropped, and without signal the drive turned just into driving. Towns became names on small wooden signs, and those names said less and less at every pull-off. Gravel replaced asphalt. Pines tightened into an array that muffled the car's usual mechanical hum. Any noise that remained belonged to the world. Wind, a distant gull, my own tires. The rental was listed by a woman named Lucy Burton. The profile photo had been a wide, honest shot of a porch and a canoe stowed beside it. The message exchange was neat and direct. Where to check in, where to leave the deposit, and a small inventory note about a weather radio on the shelf and a canoe tied to the stand by the shoreline. She wrote, "We keep things simple here. Help yourselves." The listing called the place a cabin in the Boundary Waters. I know the phrase carries weight for some people who grew up fishing in that lace of lakes, but to me it was a promise of less. Less background noise, fewer voices. That was enough. I arrived in the late afternoon, when the light had the specific thinness of the north, fewer colors, but the ones left arranged themselves with quiet deliberation. The cabin sat in a small clearing. A single-track drive gave onto a plot that slanted toward the water. A cedar porch wrapped around two sides, a kettle set on a little propane coals grill that smelled of smoke long since cooled. The air tasted like old pine, lake algae, and something else that I couldn't name. Metallic, faintly sweet, the kind of smell that made you incline your head and listen. The canoe was propped on two logs, pale wood darkening at the edges where the sun had not reached. On the doorframe a bell hung on a string, more decorative than functional, its clapper chained to a length of rusted metal. Inside, the cabin was scrubbed of effect. A shaggy rug, a propane heater, a lamp with a paper shade that threw a soft ring of light. A guest book sat on the coffee table, a small pen tied to it by a string. A battered weather radio perched on a shelf above a small counter, its plastic skin dulled by sun. There were drawers in the dresser by the bedroom, the kind of place people used to go when they wanted to be small and simple. I unpacked my bag with the care of a professional who knows that organization keeps the mind calm. I set my laptop on the table and ran my fingers over the keyboard to organize the silence in my head. I found the notebook when I reached into the bottom drawer of the dresser for a second pair of socks. It was wedged under a thin liner of paper. The cover buckled and softened at the spine as if it had spent time in damp air. At first it read like the tidy log of someone who kept track of bait caught and days gone by. Dates, a note about rain, an odd success with a smallmouth bass one morning. The handwriting was compact, utilitarian, no slanted flourishes, no unnecessary annotations, but the entries shifted. Where there was once a ledger, there began to be a slowing down, a listening, sentences that listened back. The first of the odd entries I read that afternoon said, in 2 neat lines, that blue lights had been visible over the water 2 nights ago. Small, steady, low, like someone had set a lamp on the surface and left it hovering. The pen kept to the same black ink as the fishing notes, as if the author had decided to mark down a problem the way a fisherman marks down a good tide. Later entries mentioned a tapping, a rhythm from somewhere like the reeds, and a test tone. Radio played an alert. The next line read, "No batteries." The final page I read before I shut the book, because curiosity began to unroll its claws in my chest, was a compact sentence. "If you find this, do not go out after dark." It was blunt. It was stamped with a kind of quiet, precise fear. I do editing for a living. I live in details. The notation, "no batteries," is the kind of thing I stop at. The kind of inconsistency that presses a thumb into a timeline and refuses to let go. Radios don't announce themselves without a power source unless someone made them, or someone tampered. So I walked the room, inventorying objects with the attention I would give a piece of tape. The weather radio was indeed on the shelf, as Lucy had said. I unscrewed the back, and there were no batteries. The battery compartment was empty but for a small smear of something that looked like residue. The kind left behind when batteries sit for a long time and weep a little. I paused there because I had not wanted to be the person who arrived at a cabin and immediately assumed ghost or mischief. My training made me pragmatic, check for explanations, build a chain of facts. I pulled a battery from my own kit, 2 fresh AA cells, and, half because of the professional habit and half because my chest had started to tighten, I set them in the radio. It made a small, reliable sound and the display lit up. Static rose like a tape finding its beginning. I turned the dial. It wasn't until I had the radio in my hand and the static had settled into a tone I recognized that I realized I wasn't alone in my head anymore. There was a test tone that cut through like an automated announcement. You hear it and immediately your brain seeks the words that follow. The radio emitted the sequence once, clean and clinical, then fell back to static. I pulled the batteries, and the radio made no sound. The case was cool in my palms. Whatever had been recorded in that notebook, no batteries written in ink, hadn't accounted for me, for someone who would test, who would lay palms on plastic and demand an answer. I set the radio back on its shelf like a thing that had both been and not been. Sun was draining when I drove into town to get more fuel and bait. The town felt the way any town feels when it knows it's not a destination. A main street, a square, a hardware store that sells both nails and mittens. I stopped at the bait and tackle because one needs a local talker for an atmosphere and, in practice, because the canoe rope on the shore looked like it might need a new knot or 2. The shop bell jingled. An older man stood behind a counter cluttered with lures in plastic tubs and a cooler humming with something somewhere behind him. He was called Benny, according to the patch stitched above his flannel shirt. His face was raw with sun, his hands clotted with the texture of work. He looked up at me the way someone looks up at a foreigner who has stumbled into local knowledge. "You renting the place by the cove?" Benny asked, as if in answer to some fact already obvious. "Yeah," I said. I told him Lucy Burton's name. He nodded as if that confirmed geography. "Just for a few nights." "You from away?" he asked. "You could say that," I said. "Need somewhere quiet." He hesitated a moment, then reached under the counter and pulled out a coil of old rope, thick and treated by time. "You seen the water?" he asked. He didn't wait for me to agree. "Don't go out on it after dark. If you see the lights, don't follow them. And if something tries to make a sound, don't answer. Keep to the shore, tie good knots and check your line. There are different ways people offer warnings. Some are theatrical, some paternal." Benny's voice was flat. the kind that suggests that whatever he was saying was both true and inconvenient. I made the polite, unbelieving noise of someone who wanted to roll the world into puzzle pieces. "People sometimes light things to fish with," I said, trying to account. Benny didn't argue about fishing lights. He only repeated, "Lights don't mean fish. Keep your canoe in reach." He took a packaged set of replacement batteries from a basket with one efficient motion and tossed them onto the counter. "And if you hear a bell somewhere, don't go look for it," he added, as if the bell belonged to his joke but also might belong to the lanterned shoreline. "A bell's not for calling friends out on a night like that." I left the shop with the rope and the batteries, and a mild, uncomfortable sensation of being watched by a place's memory. The sun sank while I tied new knots on the canoe rope and set birch wedges beneath the hull where the shoreline sloped. I did small, deliberate things: tighten a knot, run my palm down the canoe's flanks, check the paddles for splinters, because method steadies the mind. The lake lay flat as glass, so clean it looked like someone had painted it to keep the shore's reflection. From the dock, the water had an unexpected lacquered depth. It held the sky and sent it back with a slow fidelity. I took photographs, out of habit, out of the editing's need for reference, and then switched off the phone because the signal had been a thin thing all day. I opened the notebook that night again. The entries grew shorter, as if someone had been taking shorthand of their fear. A few lines about not being able to sleep, then a single line. Bells at 11:36, tapping like someone counting. The ink had blurred at the edges of the letters, as if damp had touched it. I set the book on my knees and read the last few things again, trying to triangulate a person from handwriting, from the staccato of their sentences. The human brain prefers a narrator, a reason. Dusk turned the lake into a surface of molten glass. Small points of light appeared, at first like insects hovering on the wind. They were low, steady, and blue, the kind of blue that sits between green and white, and doesn't belong to anything I know. They moved slowly, distant but not impossibly so, like a procession of lanterns across water. My rational brain ran through plausible explanations. Boats, fishermen with LEDs, someone doing a trick with drones, and then found every theory wanting. There were no engine sounds, no wakes that would explain the light's lack of disturbance. The reflections were imperfect, too insistently precise. The first one to come close stopped a good 30 feet from the dock, a small orb, its light like the inside of an electric fish. It hovered there, refusing the natural pull that would drag it either into the sky or into the water. It wasn't warm, it wasn't soft. It was simply an object that held light and refused explanation. I knew better than to react rashly. As an editor, I have a catalogue of things that felt urgent and later became irrelevant. But the notebook has been in the bottom drawer of a stranger's dresser for a reason. It was not a prop. The entries about the blue lights were not gossip. I walked to the canoe to check the ties, rationalizing. If someone had come down to the shore, pulled the boat free, the rope might be cut. The rope was as I had left it, a stout coil, knotted. But then I saw the strands toward the waterline, frayed and cleanly sliced, the cut equilibrated with care. Someone, or something, had cut and re-knotted the rope. The knot was clumsy in one loop, an amateur's work, but the cut itself was precise, as if made by a sharp blade. There were no footprints in the soft earth. The grass between the porch and the water lay pressed flat in a narrow line where a body might have been dragged, but the prints that would explain the path were absent, only the flattened trail where a weight had moved. I ran my hand along the canoe's rail and felt the tiny teeth of algae where the hull had been wet recently. The canoe had been in the water. I stepped back, and the small orb by the shore swelled as if reacting to awareness. Another light blinked into existence over the reeds, like someone answering a summons. They blinked in a pattern, two bright, one dim, that made my mind try to map it to a language it didn't speak. The radio in the cabin was in the back of my head as an unanswered artifact. I chose not to go back and fetch it like a talisman. The notebook's handwriting had told me what to fear. Benny's parable about bells had given the fear shape. There was a sound then, not nature, not wind, but a clean metallic ring, like two soft blows on a far-off bell. It was slow, deliberate. My skin tightened at the base of my neck. The lights moved inland a little into the birches, then stilled. A light mapped itself along the tree line for a moment and then extinguished as if someone had pinched the end of a straw. My brain did the practical thing. I took a headlamp from my bag, the one I always kept for field work, and walked the perimeter of the clearing. The air cooled immediately under the trees. I stepped on a patch of flattened grass that had been dry at the edges and dark in the center where water had permeated, fresh and not more than an hour old. A scent rose from it that I couldn't label, not quite earth, not quite rot. It made the back of my throat prickle. I took a photograph of the flattened grass with my phone and made a small voice note. I told myself I was collecting evidence, that my job was to gather data until someone else could analyze it properly. When I returned to the dock, the canoe was in motion. At first I thought the lake's mood had changed and merely tilted the boat with a small wave. Then the canoe moved again, a subtle inching forward, as if someone beneath the water had nudged it. I reached out and pushed, and the hull rocked against my palm and moved like a thing that expected to be obeyed. I grabbed the rope and pulled, and the canoe resisted with a pressure that pressed the skin below my thumb into pale channels. The radius of motion suggested something connected to the canoe's underside was applying force, testing. That was when my shin clipped the canoe's edge in a quick, distracted movement. I cursed, more from habit than shock. The scrape stung, sharp and immediate as it met fabric. There was a thin line of blood that felt hotter than it had any right to be. I swore again and leaned to inspect. There was a shallow cut, no raggedness, no blunt trauma, an incision clean as if something had slid a blade. It wasn't deep, but it was precise. I pressed my shirt to it and felt the rhythm of my pulse thudding where the injury had been. The wound made the situation smaller, more human. I had a cut. I had a functioning limb and a first aid kit. That domesticity of injury steadied me in a way that fear couldn't. I bandaged the shin with careful hands, the motions of the act restoring method where dread threatened to unspool. I wrapped the rope more tightly, wedged the birch wedges deeper to brace the canoe, and checked the knot. The cut in the rope showed fibers cleanly sheared and then tied again, in a hurried, clumsy loop. No footprints led away from the water. Nothing suggested another person had walked away. The lake was a dark sheet, reflecting a moon, not yet risen. The orbs blinked sparsely, like distant constellations. Inside the cabin, I set the notebook on the table and tried to arrange my thoughts into a log the way I would arrange sound files. Title, time, observations, hypotheses. Title, cabin rental, Boundary Waters. Time, 9:14 p.m. Observations, weather radio found with no batteries, blue lights visible over lake trees, canoe moved, rope cut and re-knotted, flattened grass, shallow cut to shin. Hypotheses, prank, wildlife, mechanical, unknown. I wrote the words slowly, as if their weight could be reduced by being recorded. Recording makes experience accountable in a way that emotion does not. The radio was silent on the shelf. I set a small recorder to pick up any ambient sound overnight, because the editor in me thinks better when tape corroborates memory. I placed the recorder near the dresser where I had found the notebook and left it running with its LED blinking a small, reassuring red. It felt absurd and rational at once. I told myself the act would be useful for later, evidence for a ranger, testimony for a report. In reality, it was a ritual. Proof soothes the mind that has been asked to hold for truth. At 11:36, the bell on the porch rang twice. It was not the decorative bell that hung from the doorframe. That clapper would have jangled a softer sound. This was deeper, two tones that knocked at the center of my chest. Clang, clang. Immediately my rational brain inventoried possibilities: someone on the porch, an animal snagging a chain, the wind. Each explanation stripped of credibility as the second clang vibrated the glass of the windows. I did the reasonable thing and reached for the flashlight, then told myself gloves would be prudent, and then told myself the logical move was to call Ranger Evelyn Hansen, who was listed at the station in the binder in the drawer. I didn't call. Calling made the fear into a conversation. Not calling let it press, small and private. Instead, I unlatched the window with deliberate hands and looked out. There was nothing on the porch. The bell's clapper waited like a bent tongue. The porch light threw a small halo. The trail of flattened grass from the water to the porch had not changed. The canoe sat tautly on its wedges. Shadows pooled in the trees like ink. I did what compulsive investigators do. I checked the evidence again. The recorder on the dresser had been running for 2 hours. I played back a portion of the file on my laptop, the sound chewing slightly as it pulled from memory. There was wind, the low breath of distant insects, the creak of settling wood, and then, faint and distant, a tone that resembled the bell on the porch but was layered with another sound beneath it. A rhythmic tapping, like a stick counted over dry reeds. It was faint, but the pattern was distinct. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap. It matched the rhythm noted in the notebook earlier in the day. I found myself holding my breath as if breath could suppress a sound. My fingers hovered above the keys like I was about to mark a cut. The editor in me wanted to isolate the frequency. The human in me wanted to hide. I picked up the guest book and thumbed through a few entries. They were the usual. Visitors, thanks, small jokes about weather. Someone had come the week before and written a polite sentence in a clean hand. The guest book offered normalcy, a thin paper wall between what I had seen and what other guests had known. It was comforting and hollow. I slept badly. The recorder kept its small red eye open like a witness. Outside, the lights over the lake bloomed and shrank like breaths. Once, I thought I heard a movement under the floor, like something pushed against the underside of the cabin with a curious testing pressure, and I woke so hard I had a small moment of vertigo. There was a domestic scale to it, wood settling, an animal in the crawl space. It was plausible. It was also the exact thing a desperate mind wants to accept, to avoid the alternative. Morning came with a thin fog that made the lake a wash of graphite. I limped like a man with a reminder of a scrape, and brewed coffee with hands that didn't shake, but which felt more sensitive than usual. I set the notebook beside my cup and read again under light that wanted the ink to show its truth. There were pages I had not seen because the handwriting tapered to nothing and then started again on a page that looked watermarked and swollen. The further I read, the less the journal sounded like a fisherman's ledger, and the more it felt like a map someone had meant to hide. One entry described the radio's test tone, repeating at midnight, though the radio had no batteries the author could find. Another short paragraph said that an orb had led the author to the edge of the trees, where something lay beside a Subaru and the guest book on the porch. It was illogical and incendiary at once. Someone, or something, had used a light to show the owner their own car, and then left a message in the guest book. The final line of that entry read like an instruction. If it points to your things, don't assume it's helping. My stomach rolled at the sentence, a small animal reactant to a scent. It was a line meant to preempt trust. I drove back to town with the notebook in my lap because I wanted to ask questions in daylight and with another voice nearby. Benny was sweeping his shop. Dust moved in the stream of light. He looked at the notebook without surprise. "Found it," he said, an observation like the way someone remarks on weather. "I found it in the drawer," I said. I told him about the radio and the lights. I told him about the rope being cut. He didn't say much at first. Then he spoke into a silence large enough to hold a story. "Those lights have been seen before," he said. "Not often. Not regular. They don't act like fish." He tapped his cigarette butt against a tin and shook his head. "You document it. That's the thing. People like us, we stitch things up, make sure there's a record. You can do your job better than I can do mine." I told him I'd left a recorder running and that I wanted to file something, enough to get Ranger Hansen to come look at least. Benny shrugged. "Rangers are busy with actual people," he said. "Still, you got the right instinct. Keep your stuff together. Don't be the one that goes looking for a story when the story looks back." When I returned to the cabin, the afternoon light had a softness that made everything feel paused mid-sentence. I unpacked my gear more deliberately, setting up a couple of shotgun mics on the porch and placing a small hydrophone in the canoe's hull, because, in some part of me, I expected the lake to be communicative if treated with the right microphone. The hydrophone's lead trailed into the cabin like a lifeline. My rational brain had built a list of why the night before might have been explainable: pranksters, faulty gear, stranger weather. My irrational brain was busy with the image in the notebook of someone being led to their car and the blunt admonition to not go outside at night. At dusk, the lights returned, slower this time. They accumulated like a small swarm over the water and then moved up into the birches with an ease that made the tree limbs look like silhouettes of fingers. They blinked in a pattern that felt coordinated. A slow blink, a pause, a quick triple. I checked the knot in the rope one more time. The cut was more obvious now that my hands didn't shake as with surprise. It was clean and deliberate. I took a photograph and zoomed in until the fibers looked like a constellation of splinters. The canoe moved again. Not a small nudge. This time it slid away from its wedges with a smooth, gliding motion that suggested more than wind. My headlamp caught on the canoe's rail as it arced an inch forward. I went down to the dock without thinking too carefully about the decision. I wanted to see what pushed it. It was the compulsion of a person trained to treat anomalies as items on a checklist. Observe, gather, log, report. The editor's compulsion can be a kind of faith in the recorded truth. I should have been more careful. The canoe, when I tried to stop it, resisted like a living thing. My foot found purchase on a slick plank, and I felt a small tug that yanked my balance. My shin struck the canoe again, this time in a sharper way that made me gasp aloud. The cut had not been deep, but it was deep enough to remind me of fragility. I tasted a small metallic tang at the front of my mouth. My hands were damp. The canoe moved as if something had pushed from beneath it and then eased away from my reach. I noticed then that the cut rope had been retied on the shoreside, not by a human hand familiar with neatness, but by something that had to work quickly. A knot, functional rather than aesthetic, the tail stuffed through an opening and tucked. There was no sign of a person leaving the shoreline. The grass around the mooring was neatly flattened, as if someone had sat, and then slid off the edge into the dark. The blue lights in the trees had grown brighter, and then impossibly arranged themselves into a line that matched the odd rhythm I had been hearing. Bells, 1, 2, sounded somewhere away to my left, and a tapping began underfoot, a little farther than the planks, as if something tested the margin where wood met air. I went back inside too quickly, the interior's domesticity offering a small shield. I set the bandage heavier on my shin, swallowed a painkiller, and pulled my jacket close like armor. The recorder on the dresser had captured the night before. I cued the file and listened. The sounds were clearer, closer. The bell, the tapping, and beneath them a kind of wet, sliding noise that could be reed against reed or something else entirely. There was a tiny, irregular pattern in the background, like a metronome trying to learn a tempo. A shadow moved at the edge of the window. It was a vertical thing that caught light from some angle I couldn't rationalize. A reflection that made the shape look as if it were lined with a pale-looking skin. I thought of the notebook again, the page that said an orb had led someone to their car and that the author had felt watched. My hands began to act in the practiced way of someone assembling a scene, locks engaged, door wedged with a folding chair, knives laid out more as comfort than supplication. At the same time, I thought in an editor's way, gather proofs. I grabbed the notebook, the recorder, and my phone and set them in a small case. I left the recorder running and took a single photo of the guest book. There were entries, smiling lines, nothing in the handwriting to foretell what I had seen. The ordinary rubbed against the extraordinary and made both more abrasive. The tapping intensified under the floor. At first it had been like a fingernail skimming wood. Now it was a pattern, slow and thorough, as if someone was probing the kerf of the cabin's foundation with a sequence meant to test load-bearing. The lamp on the table flickered with no reason I could find. Not a gust of wind, not a misconnection, just a single dip and recovery that made its round face look like it had seen something. The bell near the door rang 3 times. I listened to my own breath and realized it had become shallow. I set the notebook back in the bottom drawer. The pages had more entries I hadn't read, short, frantic notations about signals and shrieked directions, someone trying to map a language of light and metal. The act of closing the drawer was almost ceremonial. It was not closure. It was the opposite. A way of tucking knowledge into the same place it had been found, the same place a warning had been left. Outside, the blue lights blinked in a slow, almost musical cadence. The canoe moved again, quiet, as if slipped on oil. My phone vibrated on the table with a message from Donna. Simple. How are you? And for an instant I felt a ridiculous flare of gratitude for the ordinariness of it. I typed a reply with my thumb and deleted it. What could I say? The truth in a text would be unreadable. Fine felt dishonest. Unsure felt like an invitation to a conversation I didn't want to have. I left her unread. Something tapped just below where the wood floor met the wall, like a hand testing the gap. It was not random. It was rhythm and focus. It was not animal. I could tell that in the way the taps responded to the silence. I grabbed the recorder case, grabbed the notebook, and walked to the bedroom door. My hands were steadier than I felt. The crawl space hatch, there had been one I remembered from a previous scan when I checked the foundations, was covered by an old rug. The rug had a damp ring under it where something wet had been pressed against the boards. My chest tightened. I thought, for the first time since I had arrived, that curiosity could be dangerous. The editor in me argued, evidence. The human in me argued, risk. I made a list in my head as if I were inserting markers into an edit. Check hatch, listen at vent, put on boots, call Ranger Hansen. I paused at the vent and felt the tapping move again, directly below my feet this time, as if something had discovered a point of access and wanted to see if it would be admitted. I could have waited. I could have allowed daylight to decide. But the presence of the notebook in my hands felt like a ledger in the balance. I had read the warning. Now the warning lived under the floor and in the bell. The weight of responsibility, the heavy, odd responsibility of one who had found a note that might help another, pushed me forward. I reached for the rug, pulled it aside, and my fingertips pressed into wood that was damp and warm. The hatch was slightly ajar. That's where I stop, holding the edge of a thing that should not be open, a line between what was small and domestic and what pulsed with pattern. The recorder in my pocket was recording my breath. The lamp in the corner kept its small halo. Outside, the lake held its small stars close. Inside, something beneath the cabin had been tapping a language I did not know. I had the notebook. I had the radio that had once played without batteries. I had a cut rope and a bruise on my shin and a string of facts that didn't belong together. I reached down and felt, faint and slick, the rim of the hatch give under my fingers. I eased the hatch the rest of the way open with my shoulder, slow because the wood seemed to resist like a mouth reluctant to reveal what it held. The smell hit first. A sour, salt-sweet dampness like the inside of a river rock. Light from my headlamp pooled on joists and a spiderweb of insulation. The space under the cabin was shallower than I expected, low enough that my knees hit the dirt when I lowered myself, tight enough that the scratch of my jacket sounded like a shout. The tapping that had been testing the floor rose into a rhythm that matched the beat of my pulse. It was coming from somewhere deeper, threaded with a wet, sliding sound that made me imagine something gliding along damp boards. Fingers of condensation wept from the joists and left tiny tracks on the beam where something had apparently rubbed. I crawled forward, shoulder scraping a nail, and I could see the underside of the cabin floor. A series of scraping marks, shallow and parallel, as if something with short, blunt limbs had tried the board seams like a key would test a lock. There was a narrow gap under a run of insulation, an opening that didn't look deliberate, more like a place where the earth had given way. A trail of grit and algae marked a route, as if a body had been slid, low and flat, from the water's edge toward the cabin. I took a photo with my phone, and the flash made the moisture in the air glow like a field of suspended dust. The picture felt useless as evidence in that moment, and exactly the right thing to have. My hands bumped a small curved shape tucked under a layer of silt. I thought it might be bone at first because of the pale color, but it was a strip of something reflective, thin, flexible, and not quite metal. It clung to the wood as if it had grown there, and when the headlamp struck it, the strip returned light in a way that made the inside of the crawl space feel watched. I set it aside and moved on, feeling the urge to catalogue and the urge to flee at once. Something banged on the hatch from below, a soft, blunt impact that made the boards rattle where my fingers rested. The sound was not animal. It lacked the irregularity of claws, and it was not wood collapsing. It was a deliberate knock, a testing, like the tapping had been, but closer and harder. The hatch shifted in my hand as a small, damp force pressed upward, then stopped. Air moved past my face with a smell that wasn't quite water, a metallic tang threaded with the lake's green. I considered climbing back up and calling Ranger Hansen. I considered closing the hatch and leaving the recorder tape and my photos as proof. Instead, the notebook lay heavy in my back pocket. It had been found in a place someone else had hidden a fact, and the fact had instructions. Don't go out after dark. The instruction was both a warning and a test. My training told me to keep records. My humanity told me to preserve my skin. The ledger part of me rationalized that if there was any chance something below knew how to manipulate things above, the bell, the radio, the smoke alarm, then seeing how it operated might be the difference between an incomplete report and something useful for whoever would come next. I pulled the hatch open the rest of the way and slid down into the dark. The space smelled like a mouth that had been held shut too long. My knees hit packed loam, and the beam above me thrummed faintly with the weight of the cabin. I moved forward on my stomach along a narrow trench carved into the earth, the flashlight in my teeth to keep my hands free. The tapping moved forward with me, as if whatever lived below was following the line I'd left with the hatch. At some point, the trench opened into a hollow that sloped toward cold, and I felt a draft on my face. The light caught a surface, slick, pale and wet, that gleamed like the inside of a shell. The noise above me slowed, then became a chorus, faint metallic clanks in the distance, the bell tones layered over a low, almost electrical vibration. I thought I heard, very briefly, the mechanical two-note pattern the weather radio had made the night before. The test tone that had no business sounding without a power source, and it layered with the bell until the combination made the hair on my forearms stand stiff. I couldn't see the creatures. I crawled toward a low outlet where I could feel cooler air moving in, and the light from my headlamp washed across limbs pressed against submerged stones. Pale, elongated things at the waterline that reflected my beam back in shards. They were not fish. They were too structured, too deliberate. They rested with an odd symmetry, limbs bent at angles that didn't match any vertebrate I knew, each movement precise like a mechanical hinge. Their skin, if that's what to call it, caught the light in the same way that the strip I had found under the joist did. A dull, wrong gleam that made them look part mirror, part animal. One of them lifted its head, a slow tilt like that of a predator listening for the wind. Where a neck should have been, there was an articulation that made a soft clicking sound. The clicking synchronized with the tapping under the floor. They didn't move as a single mass. They moved as an organized set of instruments, each playing a different note in a pattern. It was intelligent in the way a watch mechanism is intelligent, composed of parts that know their own role. It wasn't until my lamp fell on something at the margin, an object like a small tin bell, half submerged, that I understood their method. The bell chimed when I touched it with the beam, producing the same dull clang that had been ringing through the night. The creatures seemed to time their touches to send back the same cadence, a bell's 2 tones, a pause, a 3-knock, a retreat. A language not of words, but of signals. I felt my chest tighten. My hands shook as I drew my elbow back to the hatch. The tapping became louder, as if sensing my movement. Something heavy pressed against the underside of the floor directly above me. A dull, hydraulic force, distributively testing for give. The hatch above my head trembled, so did my fingers on its rim. The headlamp flickered. At that exact moment, the smoke alarm shrieked. It was a terrible, small sound, high, piercing, immediate. The shriek startled me into a flinch so hard my knee slammed against a root. The echo in the crawlspace was a clap of broken glass. I could feel the sound in the bones of my face. Whatever had triggered it, someone had to have, in ordinary logic, had set off an alarm only a closed, accessible house could produce. But I was under the house. There was no one inside to press anything. The shriek layered over the bell, over the tapping, and for a second the signals aligned into a terrible, obvious pattern. Ring, tone, scream. Above me, the hatch lurched as if something had pushed at it. The pressure was immediate, and then a hand, if it was a hand, poured through the opening and slapped the wood where my head had been a heartbeat earlier. The slap was wet and soft. I recoiled, and the hatch slammed shut with my shoulder caught for a second between the frame and the wood. Pain shot across my ribcage. I didn't hesitate this time. Adrenaline narrowed everything to a point. I rolled sideways into the dark and pushed with both feet, kicking the small space like a trapped animal, trying to find the open field. The earth gave, the hatch swung, and I crawled out into the night, with the taste of dirt in my mouth and the sound of that smoke alarm still in my ears. When I surfaced, the porch light was a sliver because something, had extinguished the bulb. The bell above the door swung still as if it had been recently struck. The windows had a sheen, the curtains pulled in odd perpendicular shapes, as if hands had moved against them from the outside. There was a wet smear across the lower pane of the bedroom window, a clear, laddered trail, like something had slid along it from the outside, and then hooked a finger for a second at the top. The porch felt like a stage after the audience had gone, set pieces in odd positions. I ran to the canoe with the kind of speed that isn't refined by grace. My shin ached where it had been cut earlier, now throbbed in the cold like a complaint. I shoved the hull and it slid easier than it had before, as if whatever had been testing it no longer cared to resist. The water at the dock lapped without real waves. The orbs above the lake reacted like moths to a flame, drifting toward me with a curiosity that felt personal. One of them dipped close enough that its light licked the side of the canoe and left a brief wet trail of blue on the wood. I pushed off without a thought for the knot that had been cut and retied. The birch wedges slipped under my hands. Paddling felt like an act of prayer. Small, desperate strokes that sought distance. The orbs followed at a distance, not colliding but keeping pace, like ships keeping station. One of them bobbed low and then lunged at the canoe's side with a soft, rubbery sound that made water push up along the hull. It was not violent in the way of a predator. It was probing, an examination with something like curiosity. I paddled toward the faint glow of the access road, toward the impossible comfort of human lights. The orbs threaded the reeds and kept my pace. When I glanced back, I saw a line of pale shapes at the tree line near the dock. Those same wrong-angled limbs standing shoulder to shoulder, not quite in the trees, but at the edge like sentries. They kept perfect stillness against the black. I thought of the notebook, of the final, blunt line that had told me not to go out after dark. I thought about leaving it under the dresser as a record, like a geotagged clue, and wondered for a fraction of a second whether that had been what the notebook's owner intended. The thought was selfish and foolish. If the notebook had been the only way to warn the next occupant, then leaving it was both an act of hope and cowardice. A scraping noise came from the stern like a fingernail along wood. Water hissed, and a pale limb reached near enough to touch the paddle. I felt a shiver go through the canoe like a current. They smelled wrong. No animal musk, no human salt, but a mineral scent I couldn't pass. The paddle swung deeper. The shore drew nearer like a promise. Halfway across the lake, I saw headlights sweep the road. A pickup rolled up the gravel, and a man leaned out the window, cursing at the sight of a person in a canoe in the middle of nowhere. I beat my paddle, waving until his lights landed on me. He pulled over without a question and came down the slope with a blanket and a flashlight. He asked if I was okay. My voice came out as a strangled thing, and when I tried to say call someone, it came out as they. And then I stopped, because words didn't add up to what I had seen. He offered to drive me to the ranger station. I accepted without thinking. We left the canoe propped on the shore and climbed into the truck like people making a bad decision together. I smelled like lake and damp timber and something metallic, and the driver kept glancing at me in the mirror as if trying to read a signal. He dropped me at the ranger station with a terse, "You look like you've had enough," and went on with his life. Ranger Evelyn Hansen listened on the other side of a form, the radio on her desk a constant low hum. She wasn't a dramatic woman. She had the compact, no-nonsense air of someone who'd seen a lot and had time for little panic. She took my notebook and read a page without exclamation, then she slid it back toward me the way you return something fragile. Alvin Tucker, the deputy, wore his uniform with the ease of someone who'd been at the job long enough to know when disbelief was a tactful policy tool. "You say the smoke alarm went off?" Evelyn asked. Her voice had a precise cadence that made the words feel like recorded things. "Yes," I said. "It shrieked from inside when I was in the crawl space." My hands were still shaking. The hatch moved. Something hit the hatch. Evelyn nodded. "We'll come with you," she said. "Get some photos and have a look. If there was a forced entry, we'll log it." Her tone suggested procedure could fix uncertainty. We drove back with the sky already a bruise. At the trailhead siding, the ranger's truck stood like a solid promise. When we reached my car, the Subaru looked exactly as I had left it. Dirt on the plates, a small smear on the rear bumper where I had once loaded gear. But as soon as I moved, Evelyn held up a hand and walked to the passenger side. A folded scrap of paper sat wedged under the windshield wiper. My stomach dropped. I hadn't noticed it earlier in my panic. The paper was torn from a page the size of a guestbook leaf. On it had been written in the same tight hand as the notebook the sentence, "Go back inside before the bell." The handwriting matched the entries I had seen, every tilt and corner identical. Alvin's jaw tightened a little when he read it. "That's been placed there recently," Evelyn said. "The paper's fresh, no dirt under the fold." She looked at me with something like pity. "You sure you left this car here before dark?" "I parked it at dusk," I said. "I was the only car My sentence cut out. The rational explanation, someone had come and left it, felt smaller and stranger than the thing I had seen. I felt in that moment ridiculous for needing the notebook to be real proof. We went back to the cabin in a convoy, the ranger's truck and the deputy's cruiser. Alvin carried a flashlight in one hand and a pair of nitrile gloves in the other. He photographed the canoe, the cut rope, the flattened grass. He tested the knot, tugged at the birch wedges. He took dirt samples and photographed the underside of the dock. He was careful and exact, a professional who still did not have the vocabulary for what I'd described. There were recorded facts. The rope had been cut cleanly and retied. The canoe showed signs of being in water recently. The grass bore a wet, flattened trail. The weather radio still sat on the shelf. Alvin unscrewed the back of it, and I watched his face. "There are fresh batteries," he said, after a long, tense minute. "Not long in. Whoever replaced these did it before." He stopped and looked at me, not unkindly, with a look that said, correctly, that a lot could be done between dusk and dusk. Maybe Lucy had stopped by. Maybe an old renter had. Maybe a prankster. The guest book on the table contained ordinary entries. People wrote about fish and charm and the quiet. I thumbed through again and found no mention of the scrap that had been tucked under my wiper. Evelyn ran her finger down the binding, composing her next sentence. "We can list this as suspicious," she said. "But as you know," her face hardened a fraction, "we can't exactly—" She gestured at the sky, at the lack of witnesses, at the honest absence of fingerprints. The crawlspace hatch that I had forced open was closed and flush with the floor when she looked. Where I had pried a small, moisture-stained edge, there was now only grain-matched wood. No hinge or scratch revealed itself. My memory supplied detail that the physical object did not. The damp ring on the rug. The place where something had been pressed so hard into the floor that the pattern remained in the threads. Evelyn lifted the rug and smoothed her hand across the boards as if testing for vibration. She found nothing out of the ordinary, a seam where a trapdoor might be hid, but nothing a cursory inspection couldn't dismiss as normal. Alvin took a coffee cup from the sink like a small ritual and set it down. "We can file an incident," he said. "We'll take your statements, your photos. The rope," he added, pointing toward the dock, "is consistent with a sharp blade. No prints. We can submit it to the lab, but I won't promise anything." "Did you find the notebook?" Evelyn asked. She didn't need to ask. The notebook sat on the table open at a page I'd left turned. Alvin glanced at its warped spine and the water shadow that ran along the bottom, then at me. "I have it," I said. "I brought it. It's—" I felt suddenly protective of it. "It says the radio played a test tone without batteries." Alvin shook his head. "Two explanations for that," he said. "Someone rigged the radio, or someone went there, put batteries in and left, or—" He shrugged with a practiced ambiguity. "Or we have a story that resists proof." We walked the property until the light folded wholly into night. The orbs did not return. The tree line remained a line of black teeth. I felt both relieved and oddly abandoned by their absence. Evelyn and Alvin left a card with their contact details and a promise, gentle, administrative, that someone would check in the morning. I left copies of photographs and GPS coordinates and a typed list of the night's events. The ranger recorded the incident as she would with any other anomaly: time, place, observed facts, witness statements. After they left, I sat on the porch for a long while with the notebook on my knees. The radio was quiet on its shelf. The canoe leaned against its wedges like a thing that had been let go. The guest book closed with the soft suggestion of a secret folded away. I wanted to leave the notebook with the ranger, to make it an official document. Evelyn had been careful. She had suggested a follow-up and hinted at a team that dealt with strange but not immediate threats, meaning this was something that required paperwork more than immediate force. I found myself doubting the wisdom of putting what felt like a living warning into a file cabinet. Files get archived. Warnings in drawers can be found by someone about to make the same mistake. The notebook had a different function than evidence. It was a story folded into a lever to move a future. That night I slept in the car in the ranger station lot because sleep at the cabin felt like an invitation. I filled out a form with my own hand, typed a report into my laptop, and transferred the audio files. I organized what I had into an argument the way I did at work. Title, time, proof, hypothesis. The proof sat heavy in a way numbers do not. The photographs refused to explain. 2 days passed in a time that felt stretched and thin. I returned to the cabin with the deliberate slowness of someone trying to control variables. I wanted to see the place in daylight, to check the crawl space again with gloves and measuring tape. The ranger had come by the day after we first spoke, and she had left a small note wedged beneath the door. We've been here. Someone had slept in the car the night before. Please be careful. There was no judgment, only procedure. Lucy's name was associated with the property, but she answered when I called with a simple, startled distress and an apology. She said she had been traveling and had not been to the property in months. She agreed to come by during the day with an extra lock if I preferred. I told her awkwardly that the cabin felt safer with more hands, and she agreed. When Lucy arrived, she was exactly like her profile photo. Practical shoes, a neutral face creased with worry when I explained. She handled the notebook with an owner's caution. When she read, a small change crossed her face, the kind of recognition that doesn't rise to alarm, but is heavy enough to be a fact. This is the same handwriting my neighbor once showed me, she said in a voice that suggested local knowledge. She brought something home years ago. I thought she was making it up. Who? I asked. Who brought it? Lucy chewed the inside of her cheek. A renter, she said. Not long ago. She left in the middle of the night. She said something about lights and a bell. I thought she left in a hurry and had a story she needed to escape. She warned me once, don't go out after dark, she said. And She stopped. She didn't need to finish. The implication was sympathy mixed with a shrug. Small towns have residents who collect stories, and late at night, everyone who listens grows the tale. What did the ranger say? I asked. Evelyn's visit had been by the book. She had found nothing that would allow her to keep the cabin closed. There was no immediate hazard to the public, she had said. No visible trapdoor remained when she looked that second time. Lucy speculated that the hatch had been a temporary alteration, something that closed cleanly when not in use. This cabin has a cellar hatch, she said. Sometimes the boards swell and it looks flush. People step right over it and don't see it. We argued about the wisdom of leaving the notebook in the open or putting it somewhere more official. Lucy insisted that she couldn't just delete the warning. She asked if I wanted it. I thought about handing it to Ranger Hansen and having it filed, then thought of the way Alvin had pulled the radio apart and replaced batteries and how evidence had become a matter of timing and happenstance. The notebook had survived water and dampness and had been passed under a drawer liner. It had been hidden intentionally. That suggested that the person who'd left it wanted secrecy, an intentional act to warn, not to place the story in official channels. We spent the afternoon checking for any other signs of entry. I lifted rugs carefully, tested boards with a screwdriver, and laid a grid of small, flourless dust across the floor in places I considered likely. It felt like a childish experiment, but I wanted to know if someone could sleep in the room without leaving marks. I took a set of photographs from consistent angles. Lucy kept an eye on the tree line with a binocular, as if hoping to spot the orbs in daylight and disprove their existence. The sun slid down like a slow curtain, and nothing in daylight could claim the same culpability. The cabin looked tidy and small and mortal. At sunset, the lake remembered how to be something other than reflective glass. A low tide of wind moved across the surface, and the first blue dot appeared, slow and honest, right where I'd seen it before. I watched it with a taut internal script: note, photograph, call, Record. The light moved to a standstill 30 yards out and then angled a little higher, skipping across the birches as if marking their faces. Lucy stood very still and said nothing. The creature pattern emerged again. Bell, tapping, radio test tone in my memory. This time, when I went down to the dock, I brought a small, inexpensive digital camera attached to a lanyard and left it focused on the canoe. I set a second recorder in the canoe's hull itself. The idea that I could collect more and hand it to someone with a badge felt less urgent than the personal ache to make the unknown into something describable. The canoe moved. It slid away from its wedges without a wake big enough to merit the motion. I waded in shallow, boots squishing mud, and my foot caught on something near the waterline. It was the edge of a trap, a narrow seam I'd missed before because the birch wedges sat over it like a bandage. I pried the seam, and the hinge sprang open with a sigh, and under it the crawl space exhaled a cool, briny air. I looked at Lucy. She made a thin sound, a small intake that was not quite fear, but the recognition that this was not a set of marks in the mud. This was a passage. We lifted the hatch together and looked down into the same narrow trench I'd crawled through weeks ago. This time, with another set of hands steadying me, it felt less like trespassing and more like a forensic entrance. There, beneath the boards, I saw fresh marks on the underside, parallel scores like tooth marks, and a series of the reflective strips I'd found before layered along the joist. Someone, or something, had been traveling in and out through there. When Lucy reached down and touched one of the strips, it flexed and returned light like a living hinge. Her fingers trembled. "That's what the bell is for," she said quietly. "They test the entry. The bell means it's working." We did not dally. The lights were on the lake again, and the air carried a cool warning. I took the notebook from my jacket. Its pages were damp and warped in the same way as the strips beneath the cabin, evidence that whatever had tried to leave a record had been working at the edge of water and wood. I tucked the notebook into the liner of the dresser drawer the way I had found it originally, under paper and tape. And then I made the choice that felt both moral and selfish. I would leave it there, under the same edge, as if to say, "You who come after, read this." We locked the cabin that night. Lucy stayed in town. I slept in my car again, the cheap upholstery smelling like the lake and ferry. I felt oddly calm, a calm that was suspicious in the way the absence of sound can be. In the small hours, the phone on the passenger seat buzzed with a message from Donna. "You okay?" I stared at it, and then deleted it unread. There was no simple way to explain the space where a house met something else. A week later, I returned once more with a new thought. To leave something behind that might be both a warning and proof. I took the notebook out of the drawer and wrote in it with my own hand on a fresh page. Not a dramatized account. No ornate retelling, but a scaled list. Dates, times, radio evidence, the rope, the cut, the bell. I wrote, "Found by me on date. Radio played test tone with no batteries, canoe cut and moved, hatch under rug, smoke alarm triggered, lights observed. Do not go out after dark." I added my name and phone number in case the next reader wished to follow up, and folded the scrap that had been left on my windshield inside like a bookmark. When I placed the notebook back under the liner, I felt the absurdity of the gesture as a comfort. If the book had been intended as a warning, then to return it was to honor the previous author's chain of action. If the book had been a lure, then placing it back was an act of complicity. I slept better that night than I had before. Maybe that was guilt. Maybe it was relief. Months passed. I filed a larger report with the state, a paper that sat in a drawer in an office where most things are neat and clean and ask for only human explanations. Evelyn checked in once and said she had liaised with the local wildlife biologist. He had been curious, but found no evidence of any known animal working in groups to emit light and target houses. Alvin sent an email. No prints, Rope consistent with blade. Notebook remains inconclusive. The official documentation was careful not to assert the impossible. Some mornings I would think I had put the strangeness behind me. Then, on an ordinary day, editing an unrelated case in a downtown studio, a loop in the audio of another project would catch my attention, and my chest would tighten as if someone had rung a bell. Obsession is an odd thing. It curls around necessary habits. The person who edits testimony learns to inhabit the spaces between words, to stay with stories that are uncomfortable because they need to be carried. This one had chosen me in a different way. It had left me with a ledger to carry instead of a tape to master. I tried to write the experience into a neat column of explanation for my notes. Improbable, but documented. I made a backup of the files and sent them to Alvin and Evelyn and eventually to a small online forum for people who collect odd reports. People wrote theories, misidentified fishing buoys, secret military exercises, a practical joke by teenagers with LED kites. Others wrote spookier things, folkloric explanations about lake lights and the way the North holds onto odd edges. The plausible theories suffered from an inability to account for the bell, the radio, and the way the creatures seemed to use signals precisely as if coordinating. There was one person online who simply wrote, "It sounds like they were teaching someone how to leave." The sentence haunted me because it suggested coordination over time, not merely a curiosity, but ritualization. It fit the way the notebook's entries had begun with fishing notes and drifted into instruction. It fit the way the bell and radio and smoke alarm had aligned into a language of coaxing and testing. If that was true, then the notebook could be both translation and bait. I did not go back to that cabin again for a long time. There is a fatigue that comes from being the person who tells a secret. You become a steward of a story that doesn't want to be fully told. Months later, on a gray afternoon when light seemed intentionally flat, I drove north itself as if I were returning to see whether something had altered while I looked the other way. The road unspooled beneath me with a familiar rhythm, and I felt the old quiet return like a cloak. The cabin looked almost identical. Lucy had installed a new porch light and a sturdier lock. The canoe still leaned against its stand, its wood smoothed by repeated use. The birch wedges were in place like the final punctuation of a well-made sentence. I lifted the drawer liner and felt the notebook under my palm like a pulse. The pages inside bore the list I'd written, and below it a new line in a hand I didn't recognize. "Thank you for warning us." It had been added by someone who had found the book between my visits. Someone who had read the pages and responded with gratitude. I left the notebook there. I sat on the porch until the sky bruised and the first blue point bloomed over the lake. It hovered, steady and patient, like a thing that had practiced waiting. It didn't come near, not tonight. It merely marked the boundary, a light at the edge of seeing. I took a photograph, and the flash found nothing but the lake's surface, blank and honest under the camera's brief intrusion. When I drove away, I did it like someone leaving a place altered by knowledge. The road carried me south, and the signal bars on my phone climbed slowly, like a promise of connection. I thought about Donna's voice telling me to get rid of the loop in my head. The loop had not gone away. It had changed destination. Instead of being a tape trapped in my head, it had become the ledger I carried home in the form of photos and files, and a memory that could not be neatly archived. The last page of the notebook that I'm allowed, ethically, to transmit here was not an explanation. It was a sentence folded between water-damaged lines. They teach with light and sound. They test with a bell. They leave things where someone will find them. Don't go out after dark. It is simple and absolute in the way a box in a ledger is final. A small action meant to preserve another life. It is not a solution. It is a plea. I still think about the way the orbs blinked in a pattern, like an instruction not to be followed but to be recognized. I think about the way the creatures organize themselves. their reflective limbs catching a headlamp in the same wrong way that triggers the question, is it animal or is it instrument? I think about the scrap of paper under my windshield and about the motel lights that feel suddenly inadequate. What I did with the notebook might seem trivial or profound, depending on your appetite for symbolism. I put it back. I made a record. I gave what I had to the people who checked boxes and took measurements. I told the story to people who write about uncanny things and to the woman at the bait shop who told me, with the kind of plainness locals use to keep themselves useful, to document and stitch things up. I left the book because it is a book's duty to be found. If you have a theory, or if you would have done something different, left it at the ranger station, burned it, mailed it to some archive, tell me. There's value in the way a community debates small decisions, and if you loved slow burn accounts that take the time to collect the facts before the fear, subscribe for more reconstructions like this. Share this with someone who loves a good, unresolved cabin story, because there are times when the right kind of listener is the only kind who can keep a secret safe. The secret at that lakeshore sits between water and wood like a seam. It doesn't want to be solved in full, and maybe it can't be without paying a cost we aren't prepared to measure. For now, the notebook waits, and the bell somewhere on that porch still swings on its chain when the wind comes from the right angle. If you ever drive up a gravel lane seeking nothing but wind and the percussion of water, and you find a drawer with a water-worn book, treat it like a stranger's kindness. Read the pages and leave your own line, small, human, and honest, so the next person who finds the cabin knows that someone before them heard the bell and chose to answer by telling the truth.